How do all of you whimsical and inventive people? I know the intro is a little bit different than normal, but I'm trying something new and whimsical and different. Anyways, moving on. So, and everybody is all like, I could also do the other intro, howdy all of you delicious people, but I'm trying something different. Anyway, for a one time going. So, speaking of going into this, I think I'd forgotten about one hilarious portion of an episode. And ultimately, if I did bring this up, I apologize. But there's some backpedaling going on that I ultimately remember today, and I thought that this episode was hilarious. I don't know which one it is, but I think it's somewhere into the second season. So we ultimately had Josh, who seemingly had gotten in a date with a girl where we end up having this girl ending up going to this party with a bunch of her friends. And we find out that ultimately all of these friends at this party are ultimately realizing that their life may be in peril because ultimately they had found out that there is seemingly some lumberjack that they had ran over in their past, and ultimately they had found out that this guy had been resurrected by the devil to get revenge on every single one of these people at this party, with the exclusion of Josh, of course, who is ultimately assuming that, oh, my life is going to be at peril too. And ultimately, everybody is turning to Josh and says, oh, no, you'll be fine. Like, if anything, all of our lives are in peril with the exclusion of you. And ultimately, Josh is like, okay, well, I guess. Like, well, what am I going to do then? So we ultimately forcibly have Josh going and putting together a jigsaw puzzle while every single person but Josh is all getting horrifically murdered, one right after the other. And we ultimately have a window that is ultimately showing this lumberjack monsterish character that is chopping and or killing everyone outside, where Josh is just doing his puzzle. We ultimately have Josh's date ultimately going and filled with blood, ultimately going and talking to Josh, and it seems that Josh's date is ultimately like telling him like, "Aren't you gonna do anything?" And he's like, "What do you expect me to do? Like, if anything, I guess I'm just gonna do this puzzle." And so we end up having it to where Josh is desperately asking his girlfriend to do this puzzle with him, and so ultimately she agrees. While she is ultimately doing this puzzle, we eventually have this murderous lumberjack ultimately going and killing this girl while she's doing this puzzle. And ultimately, we have it where the lumberjack turns to Josh and he's like, "Oh, hey, Josh," and then he kind of just leaves because Josh is not going to be killed because he is exempt from all of this. And this is the one time where the murderous slasher man just doesn't kill anybody that's in the area regardless. He goes after everyone with the exclusion of Josh, which I found hilarious. So that is the one scene that I probably forgot from one of these episodes. Ultimately, I apologize if I don't know the episode number by hand or whatever. But I ultimately thought I probably forgot about that moment, but I thought it was freaking hilarious. And so ultimately, I'm like, did I bring that up? Did I not bring it up? But anyways, let's go on to season trace, season 3. So we are in the first 5 episodes of season 3, and so reasonably, I really like the way that they shifted the way that this story is done. I kind of like that it's kind of mostly done from mainly the perspective of seemingly the girl that Josh is going to be mostly involved with for seemingly a bulk of these 5 episodes. So it seems that this turnaround in episode 1, um, we have it to be that Josh is much more in a committed relationship in the beginning of this. So I'm like, So, are they going in reverse this time around, or are they going to have this relationship be for this entire season? Or what's going on here? I'm a little confused because ultimately I would normally have a set way of doing things, but this time around it's a little bit different. And so I'm a little confused about that. So, plus I like the way that this episode is done because, again, Josh isn't the more focal pointed thing. Actually, Josh's girlfriend is, which I find that kind of fascinating. But they are still also going and doing certain kind of things with certain actors, which ultimately, like some of those scenes, I can take them or leave them. But I also kind of find them funny too. But still, like, there's some episodes that I'm just like, God, why do they still have to keep on like going with this kind of approach? Like it kind of gets a little bit of annoyance, but anyways, when looking at it, the season's almost done anyways, halfway through. So when looking at it, I won't be able to say any more things about this because ultimately, unless they get picked up by some other network or some other thing, which would be great, uh, like a Netflix or something, because why not? With the exclusion of, well, this and learning full well that this show is ultimately uh, Lorne Michaels was ultimately a part of this. The guy who had done Saturday Night Live is seemingly also tied to this show. That kind of feels really evident because when looking at it, it seems like throughout portions of these episodes, we do have Saturday Night Live members casted within this show. So I thought that this season so far is really good. I like the fact that they go back to doing some horror elements because I think horror being mixed into this show is really the best episodes. I think anything that has any horror elements, I think, are the most funniest things or the best things. To where ultimately, when seeing a horror episode that is done within this first 5 episodes, uh, it reminded me of that other horror episode that I thought was freaking hilarious. But I ultimately probably had forgotten about it because there's so much to freaking remember with all these episodes. But if anything, again, we'll sadly see at this point. I'll need to just rewatch a lot of these episodes because God, is this show fun. Um, I'll just need to eventually just rewatch it for S and giggles. So let's go into spoiler time. Spoiler time's about the time we spoil this show. Ultimately, I don't know if I did the number count, but it's spoiler time anyways. So the very first episode is called Futon. So we ultimately have it to where it seems that in this perspective we have Lucy, who is to ultimately seemingly be working close with Josh, and eventually it seems that she ends up texting Josh at some point to ultimately have Josh go on a date with her and this and that. And so we eventually have it to where Lucy is to seemingly get easily a committed relationship with Josh. And so ultimately we have it to where it seems that, and here's the best way to represent this girlfriend within this episode. So we end up having it to where Lucy is to have her friends kind of judge Josh, or just kind of judge like any number of things. And so we have it where Lucy is to ultimately get a phone call from one of her friends mentioning that, hey, can we come over? Can we visit? Can we like have a party at your place? And Lucy is freaking out because she's noticing all the things that ultimately her friends would kind of irk about when going through Josh's apartment, like the Hulk action figures, the stain on the ground, and all these kinds of things. So we end up having it to where bizarrely Lucy is to ultimately go and seemingly clean to the heavens, ultimately by dipping every single thing of Josh's seemingly in some bad acid or toxic waste of sorts. We have it to where Josh is like, "Oh my God, no! Don't throw that away. I need those cheat codes and all kinds of things." And so we ultimately have it to where Lucy is demanding that Josh basically throw everything into this vat of toxic waste. It says acid, but I like the word toxic waste. It sounds better to me. But anyways, toxic waste is to turn somebody into a superhero, but and acid is to just dissolve something. But anyways, so we have a very much Breaking Bad episode going on here, where ultimately we have like Lucy in this this yellow jumpsuit and mask esh like gear on. I'm like, dude, this looks just like Breaking Bad. We ultimately have it to where, and I think that's where they got this idea from. We ultimately have it to where Lucy is scrubbing the floor of a stain, and we have it to where Josh is ending up having to completely dismantle his futon because it looks a little gross, it looks a little stained, and ultimately Josh is like, "No, it's a couch and it's a bed." And that is vitally important because ultimately they already have a bed, and I guess they assume that company is coming like every day. So we end up having it to where Josh is to dismantle the futon, and again, Lucy is to clean the stain of this thing, and we ultimately have it to where one of Lucy's friends is to come early. And so we have it to where ultimately Lucy opens the door for her friend. It seems that her friend is starting to be mortified and freaked out, and ultimately says, "Oh God, I'm sorry that I came so early. Like, if anything, I didn't notice you cleaning that stain or dismantling this futon. Ultimately, I'll give you this cake right now, and then I'll go back and just walk around for an hour and a half, for however long that you're finished cleaning up this entire apartment." And we ultimately have it to where Lucy just loses her stuff, and ultimately we have it to where Lucy ultimately goes and says no. Like, there's no way that this girl can get this information out, that ultimately our apartment looks bad. And so we ultimately have it to where Lucy ties her best friend up and is going to throw her off to the side of some pier or something. And so ultimately Lucy's friend is like, "Oh my God, please don't." And Josh is like, "Oh my God, what are we doing?" And so we end up having to where Lucy's friend ultimately uh ends up running away, and we have to where Lucy ends up pulling out a gun and shooting her friend. And Josh is like, "Oh my God, like you're killing people now? Like, good God, what's going on?" And so we eventually have them send her friend to the hospital, and it seems that eventually her friend ends up getting a brace on her arm. And so ultimately we have it to where Josh and Lucy are throwing a party, and it seems like the place is a lot cleaner and this and that. And so we ultimately have it to where Lucy's friend ends up coming into the party with a brace on, and we have it to where ultimately, like, their friends are ultimately asking Lucy's friend, like, "Hey, how did you get the brace?" And Lucy's like, "Yeah, how did you get the brace?" And all of a sudden you just see like her best friend like peeing her pants in fear. And I thought that that was hilarious. So we move on now to the very next episode, and ultimately that episode ends with them supposedly getting a brand new futon that ultimately pulls out into being a bed, and they have to showcase the fact of how this futon becomes or how this couch becomes a bed. And then ultimately, as soon as they try to make the couch become a bed, that's when they turn away and you don't actually see the bed, which I thought was like, of course, that's how they end it because the bed thing has to be so important, bizarrely. So, moving on. So, we ultimately have it to where, seemingly in the next episode, it seems that eventually we have a lot of times where ultimately it gets down into both Josh and Lucy eventually meeting one another's parents. And so the ranch episode, we have it to where ultimately Lucy is to meet Josh's episodes. Let's reel that back up. So Lucy ends up going and meeting Josh's parents. There we go. Uh, we end up having it to where seemingly Josh's mom ends up going bat crap crazy over Josh and or Lucy, and I love how we have it to where it seems that Josh's mom is turning into a stalker or some kind of like paparazzi-esh like person that is ultimately trying to nab a picture of Josh and Lucy together, or ultimately having like a bunch of like like a whole entire like shrine of clothing of Lucy and Josh all over her. And ultimately, we have it to where Josh's mom is to admittedly like admit that she is a big fan of Josh and Lucy, and we have it to where like they're getting really awkward and uncomfortable to the point where ultimately Josh's mom ends up being like taken out by security guards and put into jail because ultimately uh, that's of course the awkwardness that eventually this episode goes into. Eventually, it seems that we also get to see bizarrely uh, Josh's stepdad, which ultimately I didn't realize it was his stepdad. I thought it was actually his just dad, but I guess it's his stepdad. Anyways, we have it to where bizarrely at the end of this, we have it to where Josh's stepdad ultimately is to mention that at some point that he's going to have to put Josh's mother down like Old Yeller, and we have it to where Josh's dad is to have a shotgun out or a rifle or whatever, hunting rifle, whatever that is, to take Josh's mom out like Old Yeller, and so instead, we have it to where Josh's dad ultimately shoots himself in the knee, and then bizarrely reloads the gun and accidentally shoots himself in the knee yet again. To where they eventually just haul him off, and he's like, "Yeah, like my knee isn't really much of anything." It's like, my God, this show is so goofy. So, moving on. So we ultimately have an episode called "A Horse," which ultimately I'm not quite understanding the whole horse part of it, but okay, sure. Um, like, oh yeah, oh I get it, I get it. Wait a minute. Uh, we have it to where Lucy and Mike are to go to this bar, and we ultimately have it to where Josh is a little behind at getting to there because ultimately his job is bizarrely slammed. Finally, we get to find out what exactly he does at his job, which still doesn't really make sense to me. Is that place like the office? Is it like something else? What do they actually do with this job? It never made sense to me, but I guess it doesn't have to. So we ultimately have it to where forcibly Lucy and Mike are supposed to make small talk, and we have it to where Lucy is ultimately confessing to Mike all little secrets that ultimately at some point Josh had told her and I guess never had told Mike. I'm like, wait a minute, why is it that Mike doesn't know all of this stuff, but Lucy, a girl that seemingly, like, why is it that he's confessing all of this stuff to Lucy, which we don't know how long they've actually been dating for, but Mike doesn't know any of this stuff. So we end up having Lucy gossip to Mike about all the stuff that she shouldn't have actually said to Mike, but she has nothing else to really say. And she ultimately mentions how Josh is afraid of horses, and ultimately that, like, he has, like he has problems with this and that. Ultimately, all of his like she basically starts to divulge a bunch of stuff that makes no rational sense, and Mike is like, "Oh my god, really?" And so we ultimately have it to where everybody is like ultimately just like, "Yeah, like she's going the up and up." So we eventually have it to where Mike is to spill to the world via this bizarre press conference that with him being on some TV screen, every single one of the little secrets that ultimately uh, Lucy had divulged. At some point, we had heard that ultimately Josh, who ultimately is in band and has played clarinet, uh, ultimately had a boner of sorts at some recital, and we ultimately had the clarinet that ultimately had gone within this boner of sorts, and so ultimately it's a very weird approach to figuring out what had happened with all that, and so we end up having it to where Lucy ultimately goes to this press conference to hear Mike spilling the beans of all these secrets, and we eventually have it to where Josh accidentally goes to this same press conference and hears all these divulging secrets that ultimately Lucy and him know, and ultimately Josh is betrayed, and ultimately he leaves. Because we had it before, where ultimately we had Mike bizarrely texting Josh a photo of a horse, and we have it where Josh is utterly mortified. He's like, "Oh my god, I'm afraid of horses," and Mike sent me a picture of a horse, and so we ultimately have it where Mike eventually texts the word like "Did I scare you?" kind of thing, and ultimately, like Josh is like, "How did he know about me being afraid of horses? The only person that I told that to was you, Lucy." To where Lucy says nothing, and otherwise, eventually Josh eventually gets betrayed. So we eventually have it to where reasonably Mike and Lucy are basically forced into yet another awkward conversational thing where eventually they seem to be locked in with a cave of sorts that ultimately is being enclosed, and ultimately we have it to where Lucy is to desperately try to talk about Mike about common stuff. To ultimately there is some kind of rocket and or thing being shot down to Lucy to come up with conversation and all kinds of things. So we eventually have some point where Lucy eventually talks to Mike, and ultimately Josh rescues them from this whole cave in, and ultimately they kind of succeed with this whole episode. So moving on, we ultimately have an episode called Popcorn. So it seems this time around we ultimately have it to where Josh is to go to Lucy's family because things have just consistently worked out. And so we find out that seemingly Josh's mother and father have some weird, creepy thing going on where ultimately we have it to where when Lucy and Josh are to go through this house, we have Josh's mother and father kind of bizarrely, like, quickly showing up behind them to simply do some kind of scary motion that ultimately Lucy is terrified about. Ultimately, it seems that Josh is kind of working his way to ultimately win Lucy's parents over by playing some Bananarama game or something like that. And we have it to where eventually Lucy is ultimately getting terrified by her parents, and Josh is ultimately like going like, "Dude, like, you know what? I'm actually taking your parents' side on this. Like, why are you so terrified of them? And ultimately, like, they had helped you done this and this and this in your life. Like, what do you have to complain about?" And so we have it to where ultimately Lucy is to be kind of upset that Josh had taken the side of her parents, and so she goes up to the attic to seemingly go into this Narnia-esque like land where bizarrely there are seemingly these cute little monsters that ultimately arrive to justifiably reunite with Lucy to only to be like, oh my God, Lucy, it's been years. Like the ultimately, it seems like they look like giant Chewbacca-esque like Muppet monsters, and so recently it seems that they are reminiscing about old times, and eventually we have it to where Lucy is to talk to them about her troubles, and it's like, well, hey, like, uh, so what are you doing here? What are you doing here? Like, if anything, like some like it's been such a long time, and we've all kind of gone our separate ways. And we have it to where Lucy's like, well, I want to run off, like I want to run away and just be with you guys forever. And we have it to where the monsters are just like, yeah, that sounds great and all, but like, if anything, you need to go back to your own life and like you need to like live your life kind of thing. And so we have it to where Lucy it had gotten some kind of book from her parents, and so this monster is trying to explain all this financial stuff that Lucy is supposed to like eventually figure out through reading this book. But ultimately, this monster tells her this thing in this book, anyways. So it eventually seems that this monster is to give Lucy a giant thing of Prozac and send her on her way. And so it seems that everything through this episode had ultimately just worked out bizarrely. So we ultimately have it to where, and here's when we get to a really sticky wicket and or bizarrish episode. So we ultimately have it to where Josh is talking with Lucy's parents, and they are talking about some poster that she's ending up designing. And Josh ultimately kind of going into like going and saying like, well, you know what, I think like her poster is actually pretty amazing, and I think reasonably like it's gonna do really well, and I think like she's gonna go places. And so we ultimately have it to where when Josh goes back to his apartment, it seems that uh, that Lucy ends up going really well with her career, and then ultimately Josh is like, you know what, maybe I should try to do something artistic. Maybe I should try to attempt to try and draw something or paint something to be able to kind of go on the same career path that Lucy is doing, because otherwise, what do we have in common? So but of course, this goes horribly awry, like any normal episode would go into. And so we end up having it to where Josh ultimately is to paint a thing of cherries. Oh my god, I completely spaced out. Um, God, there had been. There was one episode that they talked about. Uh, yeah. In the futon episode, we also had it to where Josh was to uh, be a guy that was kind of like a what is the word? Um, we had it to where Lucy is going with her friends, and ultimately they don't want Josh to kind of sponge off them at this at the place that they are at. So ultimately we have it to where they had made like if they had made a law before, ultimately Josh had made a law to ultimately make it so that a woman would forcibly be if he were to be nice to some girl, there was some law in place, or if he were to be nice to some girl, that ultimately that girl would have to forcibly go out with him, the Rosa era. And ultimately in this one, we had it to where they made a law where there's no freeloaders, but it ended up kind of sounding like it was kind of a play on like illegal aliens and foreigners and kind of something like that, which I thought was a little bizarre. But I also kind of thought it was like an interesting way of spinning things. But anyways, so we eventually in this episode, and I want to try to get this right, because we ultimately have it to where they're going to some dinner party, and Josh is to meet this kid that is ultimately a kid that can see people that are unsuccessful. Kind of the jokingly spin off of The Sixth Sense, where ultimately it's like, I see dead people. No, this kid can see unsuccessful people. And so ultimately, this kid ultimately knows every single person, every little bit about their past that is ultimately to lead them to be unsuccessful. And so this kid can see an unsuccessful person. And ultimately, we have it to where this kid is ultimately talking to Josh, and he's also a unsuccessful person. And we have it to where the mother is ultimately asking, like, "Who are you talking to, son?" And she's like, "No one." And he's like, "No one." So he walks off, and ultimately Josh is to assume that he's an unsuccessful person, which is going to push him into painting and or drawing. So we find out within this episode that Josh has ultimately tried painting, and I'm trying to avoid this a little because when looking at it, it's a very hard thing of painting to look at, so to speak. So you ultimately have it to where Josh is consistently trying to paint something, and at first he is saying that, yeah, I tried to paint cherries. And so him trying to paint cherries was ultimately to have it look like he's giving an animal a BJ, and ultimately we have it to where this animal is a cat, or no wait, this animal is a dog, and ultimately the dog is saying, "Wolf, wolf, thanks for the BJ." God, this is a little bit stupid. So we end up having it to where Josh is like, you know what? Maybe I can slightly change this painting to look a little bit better, and instead it makes it look even worse. And so we end up having Josh ultimately confronting Lucy to ultimately say, like, yeah, I guess you're just going to be successful, and I guess I'm just not, and I guess I'm just going to have to deal with it. And so we have it to where Josh ultimately had tried to do several paintings after that horrifying success of his first one. And so ultimately he's like, yeah, I did a lot of other rough drafts to to try and ultimately do other fruit or do other things, and it ends up that he ends up giving a BJ to seemingly every animal in the animal kingdom at some point. And every single other animal, even if it's an owl or anything like that, we end up having it to where every single animal goes woof woof, thanks for the BJ. And we end up having it to where Lucy is ultimately asking, like, oh my god, like, why is it woof woof every time? And we have it to where Josh is like, I don't know, like, it must just be my pattern, my hook, my design, or whatever. Because ultimately we have it to where Josh was ultimately he was trying to paint like oranges, and it came out animal horrific time. And we end up having it to where ultimately Josh had pictured in his mind a like him giving a owl a BJ, and so ultimately like it ended up turning out to be an owl actually being in this act. And so like Josh was like, yeah, I guess no matter what I did, it just ended up being this horrific act. I think really with this episode, I think this episode kind of showed you that when really looking at it, they were kind of looking at some things to be offensive or otherwise just go into this realizing that they were going to get canceled. So, like, why not just kind of throw these things out there as a thing to ultimately show, like, well, when looking at it, hey, like, since we know we're gonna get canceled, might as well try to be vastly different than any other show that's out there, I guess. We ultimately have it at some point where it seems that there is some homeless woman that ultimately gets her own segment at the tail end of one of these episodes, which I thought was interesting. Uh, so ultimately, at some point, Lucy was supposed to get executed in one of these episodes, and we ultimately have it to where there's one homeless woman that is to ultimately. I think this might be the episode where Lucy was uh, gabbing about Josh's secrets, and so we end up having Lucy going and getting executed, and so we have this homeless person that is ultimately like, we want the execution, and they're ultimately like, no, we're not going to do this execution, and so ultimately we have it to where bizarrely this homeless person ends up just going about and uh, just kind of going and like having bizarrely her own ending segment, which I thought was bizarre. But I guess when looking at it, like they were trying all kinds of weird and odd things because why not? Maybe they were going to try to do a spin off after this, which I don't know if that would happen. But, anyways, I think that's all I wanted to say about these episodes. There's so much crap to talk about in every single one of these episodes. So, when looking at it, I'm probably going to forget about some portions. There's so much going on that when looking at it, like, I want to try to, like, remember everything, but when looking at it, there's a lot of stuff that falls through the cracks. There's a lot of funny moments that ultimately I missed out about, and because there's so much crap going on, there's just like, and I don't want to say crap meaning that it's all bad stuff. No, it's just a lot of layers of episodes where ultimately it's just like, especially in the early goings, like it was a lot of repetitive, like same things going over and over and over and over and over again, to where like Josh was just running through women, and to where this season is kind of slowed down just a little bit, and it seems that ultimately Josh has found somebody, or someone had found Josh, and so ultimately yeah, that's where eventually this show is going to. I'm kind of expecting there to still be a possible Liz episode mixed in here somewhere. Um, I'm still expecting there to be probably more of Mike and uh, more of a Mike episode somewhere in here probably, or this and that, because ultimately we've already done the parents episode. So what else do we got going left? But anyways, I'm going to get out of here. I enjoy this show, no matter what I've kind of said about it, positive or negative. Uh, Either way, I can still say that I really and thoroughly enjoy this show, and ultimately I want to go back and just watch this all over again and just enjoy it for what the mixed bag of what it brings. I think recently, yeah, I'm just gonna enjoy this show for what it is, for however many episodes that are left. But at first, I still have to finish off the tail end of this second half of this third season, and then eventually we'll just call it a day for reviewing this. Sadly enough, so one episode left, and then ultimately we are to be done with this show. Sadly, and so yeah, I'm gonna get out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Bye, everybody.